Good morning. Is this morning, afternoon? This is yes. Thank you. Thank you very much to the conveners of the conference. I'm a little Professor Bafour. Thank you, sir. That last intervention, because yes. How do we respect the contributions? And I think we should acknowledge that it becomes very difficult, but it is important to give the time to people who have prepared and who have traveled, and we'll see how we work our way through it. I will try to shorten. I will shorten. I won't try. I will shorten. But I really want to lodge a formal protest at how this was handled. In terms of the information in the book, I was remiss in not responding in a timely manner because I was traveling with an appropriate bio and my abstract and the photo, so all that's kind of missing. But for the record, I am presenting as a representative of the 8th Pan-African Congress North American Delegation, as a person who does bring a wealth of history through support for the African Liberation Support Movement and the global Pan-African movement of over 40 years. I have served as a technical advisor for the African Union and was a member of the organizing committee for the World Conference Against Racism and xenophobia and other related intolerances held in Durban in 2000. As well as other activities. I also encourage you, given the discussion that I've heard so far, to understand that this conversation takes place in the context of a larger discourse, that there are numerous conversations and dialogues taking place on the African continent that we should be aware of, as well as in other parts of the diaspora. And this is where I cut it short. Yes. There is one human race, and there are a number of cultures, ethnicities, language groupings, faith groupings, etc. within that. The model that Juliana West used yesterday, there's an iteration of it that actually places ideology, worldview, paradigm, perspectives at its own level. And then below that, institutions and individuals. And I think that that's at least for me, more helpful analysis because it helps us to understand what is it that really guides all the other actions of society? What is that thinking? What is the paradigm? What is the worldview that really undergirds all those actions? And so for me, recently, and I say recently in the last 8 years, looking at what I've seen as really this visceral response, this visceral reaction to the gains and achievement of people of African descent around the world. And so this question of this symbolic voice, this symbolic voice of violence that really sits below a lot of what's happening in the world against people of African descent. And then so specifically, we're talking about power. And for me, we're talking about power, we're talking about elites, and we're talking about the management of that power against those without. And so the symbolic violence in this context speaks to meanings and the ability to impose those meanings, but then in the end, they conceal the power relations that exist and that are actually being promoted. All right, so what are they? The other. It is always about creating the other, being able to somehow distinguish and therefore minimize the capacity of the other to be able to meet you on equal grounds. That led to a movement known in part as the eugenics process or movement, and eugenics was used as a way, was a scientific, an academic discipline, and a way to justify the exercise of power as a basis of colonialism. So you really had quote unquote academics going around the world measuring people's heads to determine their capacity for intellectual thought. And so, excuse me? Okay, so so why was this? And I think about what was the fear? Before Tinder, before The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, there was the eugenics certificate. And so you could actually go to a doctor and you would get a statement from the doctor that you were a confirmed member of the Caucasian race and therefore one who was valid and legitimate and therefore, capable of passing on good genes to continue the furtherment of the human race, or actually the Caucasian race, before Tinder. So again, and then so even though this slide looks at U.S., we can take almost any Western government or power and use it in the same place. So we've had discussions this morning about, the Canada and the role of immigration. So we say, what was the fear? That somehow the other, represented as all these other ethnicities, all these other communities, all these other cultural groups, would somehow overwhelm that which represented the dominant power, even though the dominant power itself existed by virtue of having forcibly taken the land, particularly in North America, from the indigenous people. Again, this is one of the ones that's a little difficult, but again, why? 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 And in the end of this cartoon, it says that the question is assimilation. Why won't you accept me? Because you won't drink whiskey, you won't talk politics, and you don't look like us. You won't drink whiskey, be our culture, use our cultural patterns. You won't talk politics, be who we want you to be, and you don't talk like us. No, I never will. And so, but the dominant culture uses its power then to isolate those elements they see specifically as capable of being a threat or of not being able to be managed. And so for the Chinese community in North America, whether it was Canada or the United States, it was, although they were brought in as laborers and played a significant function in terms of labor movement, they were denigrated as a cultural grouping by highlighting these particular aspects of their culture, their community, and then making them part of this threatening other. For African Americans, it was the question of the post-enslavement period, which is known formally as Reconstruction. And there was this, again, this patriarchal image of the community being this helpless, emaciated person being helped by this kindly white man, in this case, Abraham Lincoln, with this bowl of soup. And this is sort of an image we see, replicated through when we talk about refugee situations and we talk about struggle situations, not only in Africa, but other parts of the world. So we always have this benevolent image coming in and being of assistance to this emaciated, ill-formed, incapacitated person. But yet, of course, this is far from the truth. Because at the end of Reconstruction, although there were a number of people of African descent who, yes, were underfed, malnourished, etc., there were also a number who were not in that condition, and there were actually a number who had acquired land at that point and who were actually functioning as as serious members of the economy, and there were actually in the cities large numbers of free people of color. So at the period of emancipation, as we talk about these other communities, and as you've had discussions about communities in Canada, understand that at no point in our history have people of African descent been a monolithic community or a community of the same type. It's been all class with a number of different interests, possibilities, and capabilities. But again, the othering continues. And so this question of the watermelon, where it came from, it's one of those things. But we just talk about the images. And I've got another one, the exaggeration of certain features. So we talk about, the expansion of the mouth, the bucking of the eyes, extremely dark coloring, although again, we know people of African descent represent a range of physical colorings, and then the speech patterns. So we have the, white master saying, "Say, Sambo, don't you think this piece of watermelon is just right?" Using articulate English and expressing himself accordingly. And the brother comes back and says, "Well, golly, boss, that ain't half big enough," you know? And so there's also this element of greed, that somehow we always need more, we have to have more, you know, what we have is insufficient. So again, you know, what is the fear, and why is it important to keep these kinds of ideas at the level of ideology, undermining? Okay. Now how do I keep it? Okay, thank you, sir. No. Okay, you don't count this in my five minutes. Okay. And this was 1916. No, I'm sorry, this was 1866. This is 1866. And these were actually two Caucasian politicians, but because one supported Reconstruction and the rights of people of African descent, he was characterized in this political bulletin as being African American. So not only are African Americans characterized physically, you know, or caricatured, but then white people who supported African Americans are caricatured with the same physical attributes. Okay? Then in terms of Reconstruction, there was the federal government, as part of the process, said that given the contributions of African Americans to the war effort, that people would be reimbursed 40, or people would be given 40 acres and a mule. And that would enable them to begin their economic self-sufficiency. Well, of course, that did not happen. There were a number of other things that either did not happen or compromised the ability of people to succeed. But this particular cartoon then says, really plays on that and says, it's not just about the 40 acres, we'll give you $5,000, and it's about buying of the vote. That somehow we are unable to understand the value of the situation that we're in and unable to make political decisions about our lives and the kinds of issues that we think are important to our growth as a community. So, but again, now we have the woman. So this is, and again, and what's interesting to me again here is that there are two representations of African American women, particularly up to 1950, and it's either the infanticide, where you've got this childlike figure with the pigtails, which is a common hairstyle for young girls, or you have the oversexed. Well, there are three: the oversexed image, and then you have the mammy. But again, that's beyond my 5 minutes. And this one then really brings everything together, because it's saying that rampant black crime is what's bringing the nation down. Now just think about, you know, the recent political history in North America, and you can substitute a different language there. But then look at the image, because we have the hero, the white male with his, you know, baton. We have the brother who's represented as this incredible monster, vivacious with the tongue hanging out, and then we have the fair damsel, okay, with the blonde-haired, big bosom, who is in danger of being swallowed whole by this monster unless she can be rescued by the hero. And this is the image that's being really promoted, in particular in the U.S., behind the question of the border. So when you hear the federal government said, if we don't close the border, you know, those Mexican gangs will come in, and then who knows what will happen. This is the exact same language and image that was perpetuated about African Americans. And then we have the brother here saying, well, it feels like my experience in North America, in America is different. Very articulate, very calm, very rational. And what's the response? Why do you all always have to talk about race? So even when we come with a reasoned, well-thought, well-articulate statement of our condition, somehow within the, you know, societal discourse, we bring it back to questions of race. This one, the Green Book, was a document published by a man in New York, for over 25 years. He was a postman, and he liked to travel. And he was representative, basically, of that group of African Americans who had come north for jobs, gotten good employment, and now wanted to return south to visit family and friends. But between the 30s and the 50s, this was like really a highlight of a period of lynching in the United States. It was very difficult for people to know where to go safely. So if I wanted to move from Ohio to Georgia to visit my family, I would really start first by talking to various people about where I could sleep, where I could eat, where I could get gas without having my life threatened. So I have economic status, but within the South, I have low social status. And so the Green Book was used to guide people successfully through this process. The next 3 slides really speaks to that question of internalized oppression, because although, for instance, African Americans were part of the object of the desegregation movement of the 50s, unfortunately, we turn back around and we begin to be part of the group that protests the integration of Latinos in many of our communities later. In a similar sense within the women's movement, and this is from 1913, this particular cartoon, where you have the women's movement, and some of you may know that Frederick Douglass was instrumental in highlighting and discussion and bringing it together. But you have the women's movement saying, this is a fight for white women only, no sisters allowed. And this is from the UN Conference on Racism, talking about, well, what about the caste system in England? And you have the representative of the, in India, saying untouchable, which is a double entendre there, but there you go. And then South Africa. And I just hope you take a moment, because unfortunately, when President Julius Nyerere died, I really thought that South Africa should close, number one. But number two, that at a minimum, every federal agency, every school should take an hour to understand the role that one country played in bringing the liberation of South Africa to bear. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen in part because South Africa, the black South Africans are really indicative of this unique phenomenon where they were ostracized and the lowest of the low in their own country, but they had internalized perceptions of themselves as still being better than other Africans. So I can't tell you how many times people said to me, oh, you've been to Africa? Tell us what it's like. Or we understand you just got here from Africa. And so they had bought into the apartheid mentality that somehow South Africa and everyone in it was different. What that meant was that 20 years later, you've had a series of rolling riots and oppressive actions against people of from other African countries, which has resulted in xenophobia within South Africa, which is just a travesty. So how do we react? We react bit by bit, whereas we should be putting out the whole fire. Racism is deep-rooted, as is all these other intersectionality elements. Yes, band together as brothers or put out as fools. This is what we stand for: one Africa, one people, one global African family, number of other issues, and I will end there.